In my series on Pedagogy of the Oppressed, today I'll be concluding my conversation on unity of liberation. This is the 20th episode on Chapter 4, and we are almost approaching the end of the book. So let us see how Freire particularizes and describes the experiences of the Latin American peasants. I'll first read and then come and talk about it briefly. Proposing as a problem to a European peasant the fact that he or she is a person might strike them as strange. This is not true of Latin American peasants, whose world usually ends at the boundaries of the latifundium, whose gestures to some extent simulate those of the animals and the trees, and who often consider themselves equal to the latter. Men who are bound to nature and to the oppressor in this way must come to discern themselves as persons prevented from being. And discovering themselves means, in the first instance, discovering themselves as Pedro, as Antonio, or as Josefa. This discovery implies a different perception of the meaning of designations. The words, world, men, culture, tree, work, animal, reassume their true significance. The peasants now see themselves as transformers of reality. Previously, a mysterious entity, and they can move from consciousness of themselves as oppressed individuals to the consciousness of an oppressed class. Any attempt to unify the peasants on activist methods which rely on slogans and do not deal with these fundamental aspects produces a mere juxtaposition of individuals, giving a purely mechanistic character to their action. The unity of the oppressed occurs at the human level, not at the level of things. It occurs in a reality which is only authentically comprehended in the dialectic between the sub and superstructure. Now, if you have followed my previous conversation about unity of liberation, you already know that what he's talking about is the unity of the people, and then unity between the people and the so-called leaders. And that unity is absolutely necessary for revolutionary change. Now, he also taught us in that part that the dominant group will try to destroy that unity. It is easier for them to close ranks and try to destroy any attempts at unity, while the function for the leadership and the people in a revolutionary movement is harder because the consent cannot be forcefully ascertained. So in this part of unity of liberation, he is particularly talking about how we need to understand the experience of majority of Latin American peasants and how and why we cannot immediately move into class consciousness. Individual consciousness must come first. So in what I just read, the main concern for Freire here is, as he starts by saying that when you talk to a European peasant, they have no doubts about their own individuality. You don't have to pose the question of who they are. But the depersonalization for Latin American peasants is so deep that the first attempt cannot just be, hey, let's get together. It cannot be driven through class consciousness because individual consciousness must be structured, built, and strengthened before we can move on to class consciousness. There's a moment where he says that their identities are bound by the latifendium. Okay, so what were the latifendiums? These were large land holdings derived from the Roman tradition, but in most of Latin America, before the countries got their independence, large tracts of land were given to large landholders. But they were also given the right to recruit and forcefully recruit people to work on their land holdings, sometimes even slaves. So what he's saying then is that the consciousness of these peasants is limited by the limit of the land holding where they've lived most of their lives. Their identities are as identities of people who are enslaved to a single landowner or a single master. Where he mentions the proper names, what he's trying to highlight is that these people, the peasants, do not even think of themselves as autonomous entities with individual names. They see themselves as part of the landscape, as part of the natural world, the trees, the animals. So the first set of consciousness that they must achieve is a consciousness of them being autonomous human beings. Now, if you remember chapter 3 was where Freire had taught us how to develop a curriculum with the help of the people, where they come and share how they view the world. We put it in the curriculum, and then they see their own world objectively as a subject of study. Those were steps towards achieving individual consciousness and then eventually a consciousness of the world. Now, what he's cautioning against is what he calls later, sloganeering or mechanistic activism, where somebody comes along and says, let's move it, people, we need a revolution. But if the people themselves are not aware of who they are, if they have not studied the reality objectively, if they have not defined themselves in clear terms, then in the end they will be mobilized by someone else for their own cause. That's why towards the end of these passages that I just read, he talks about the dialectic, right, between the sub and superstructure, the base and superstructure, right? And the base, what is the dialectical relationship? That the superstructure sometimes obviously determines the base, but then the base also determines the superstructure and props it up. And that dialectical relationship between the peasants, who must first achieve individual consciousness and start thinking of themselves as human beings and not an entity or not an extension of their masters, and then building deeper solidarity, deeper unity, instead of sloganeering, right, or just mechanistically hoping to develop class consciousness. So that is what I get from these passages that I just read. Let us read a little more, and then I'll come back and talk about it. In order for the oppressed to unite, they must first cut the umbilical cord of magic and myth which binds them to the world of oppression. The unity which links them to each other must be of a different nature. To achieve this indispensable unity, the revolutionary process must be, from the beginning, cultural action. The methods used to achieve the unity of the oppressed will depend on the latter's historical and existential experience within the social structure. Peasants live in a closed reality with a single, compact center of oppressive decision. The urban oppressed live in an expanding context in which the oppressive command center is plural and complex. Peasants are under the control of a dominant figure who incarnates the oppressive system. In urban areas, the oppressed are subjected to an oppressive impersonality. In both cases, the oppressive power is to a certain extent invisible. In the rural zone, because of its proximity to the oppressed. In the cities, because of its dispersion. Forms of cultural action in such different situations as these have nonetheless the same objective: to clarify to the oppressed the objective situation which binds them to the oppressor. Visible or not, only forms of action which avoid mere speech-making and ineffective blah on the one hand and mechanistic activism on the other can also oppose the divisive action of the dominant elites and move towards the unity of the oppressed. So what is this umbilical cord of magic and myth that must be severed before the people can come together? I mean, we can interpret it in many different ways. It could be religion. It could be a cultural internalization that we are who we are. That's the nature of things. And masters are masters because they are naturally so. So anytime someone internalizes the oppressive order in a way where they think it's either dictated by forces larger than us or that it is natural, it's that kind of mythification. Now we have learned through the process of the book how to undo that, and critical pedagogy is a path to that, right? And cultural action. So what he's telling us here is that before we can try to build unity for liberation amongst the people, people must first, of course, gain their full realization that they are individuals, and they must sever their connection with any mystification or mythification where their identities are fixed. So we also learn in these passages that the cultural action aimed at creating the unity of the oppressed must also be attentive to the specificities of the oppressed people. He starts this discussion already with the particular experiences of Latin American peasants. Now, according to Freire, these peasants are in a closed reality. That is the reference to the word they have. So first, through critical pedagogy and cultural action, which of course is praxis of critical pedagogy, we must open that word. We must sever their connection to all the mythical and mystical views of life that they might have internalized. Then we must understand that the nature of oppression for the urban subproletariat or oppressed is different as compared to the rural oppressed. So if the rural oppressed are part of a plantation, they have a centralized figure who controls their lives. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they think that is the seat of their oppression, because they are so close to the source of power that controls their lives, and since they think of their life as natural, they may not even see it as an oppressive situation. And that's where first the consciousness of self as individuals comes, and then the class consciousness of being in this oppressive relationship with this visible master figure. Now, in the urban nature of the oppression, what he's talking about is that people are oppressed through various loci of power. And those webs, those systems of power are mostly invisible, but they still control people's lives. So what that tells us is that the collective action, cultural action, in trying to build unity of the oppressed would depend upon where we are. We cannot just use the same modalities and same methods that we have used in rural parts ipso facto in the urban struggle. And that particularity needs to be absolutely kept in mind. The end of the revolutionary praxis is the same, liberation of the people. But the methods might vary depending on where we are. So overall, to conclude this really brief conversation about the second part of unity of liberation, what we have learned then is that in case of Latin America, especially rural parts, before we try to develop a class consciousness and a class unity, the first step before that would be to develop individual consciousness for the peasants. Now remember, in one of the previous chapters, in one of the footnotes, I talked about this, that Freire points out that the situation is so dehumanizing that some peasants sell themselves into slavery to make a living without realizing that what they are doing is a dehumanizing practice for themselves. So that's the level of dehumanizing that he's talking about. So overall, by now then, in his explanation of the dialogical modes of resistance, which he offers against the anti-dialogical modes of oppression, we talked about cooperation, which was the first one, and how to build that. And we are now finishing discussing the unity for liberation, or unity of liberation. One thing that he's cautioning us again and again is not to rely on empty sloganeering, right? On just blah, or on just, we're going to change the things, come with us. People cannot just be led into a revolutionary praxis by the leaders, by the promises of the leaders, or by their slogans. People must prepare themselves, must discover themselves, must be ready. And then, with cooperation between the leaders and the people, where the leaders don't ever try to say that they know better, where they are led by the people, a people who have already discovered the nature of their oppression. That is the subtle balance absolutely necessary to change things for the better, to destroy the oppressive order and to replace it with a more egalitarian, just, and compassionate order. Now you can take these insights. As I always point out, my insights and my understanding is not exhaustive. It's limited by my knowledge and my experience. But you can take these insights and look at the world where you live and see how can you think through these insights about the world in which you live. And if you are involved in any kind of outreach with oppressed groups, ask yourself, am I coming top down? Am I bringing my own knowledge and telling these people this is how you do things? Or do I spend time in sitting in communion with people and learning from them, and then together helping each other, gaining a kind of unity which is based in a deeper understanding of the nature of oppression and our own identities in it? So that's all I have for today. I'll be back with more. I hope to conclude the book soon, and I'm hopeful that this is useful to you. If not, do let me know. But if it is beneficial to you, share your thoughts. If you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the comments. I'm deeply grateful for your time and for your support. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Take care. I will see you soon again. And until then, as always, peace and love.